on chapter 5 of the book from Robert Monroe, Journeys out of the body. I don't know. I just don't know. Infinity, eternity. Chapter 5. The best introduction to Locale 2 is to suggest a room with a sign over the door saying, please check all physical concepts here. If getting accustomed to the idea of second body was an uneasy experience, Locale 2 may be hard to take. It is certain to produce emotional effects as it steps solidly upon what we have accepted as reality. Furthermore, many of our religious doctrines and the interpretations thereof become open to question. It is enough to say that only a small part of the visits into Locale 2 via the second body has provided evidential data for these visits do not easily lend themselves to proof. Therefore, much of the Locale 2 material is cautious extrapolation. However, several hundred experiments in this particular area have provided definite consistencies. If A plus B equals C 63 times, this is a higher order of probability that A plus B will equal C the 64th time. Postulate. Locale 2 is a non-material environment with laws of motion and matter only remotely related to the physical world. It is an immensity whose bounds are unknown to this experimenter and has depth and dimension incomprehensible in the finite conscious mind. And this vastness lie all the aspects we attribute to heaven and hell. See chapter 8, which are but part of Locale 2. It is inhabited, if that is the word, by entities with various degrees of intelligence with whom communication is possible. As noted in the peculiar analysis in the latter chapter, peculiar? And how did I get peculiar? And it is noted in the percentile analysis in the latter chapter, the fundamentals are altered in Locale 2. Time by the standards of the physical world is non-existent. There is a sequence of events, a past and a future, but no secular separation. Both continue to exist coterminously with now. Measurements from microseconds to millennia are usual. The other measurements may represent these factors in abstract calculations, but this is uncertain. Laws of conservation of energy, force field theories, wave mechanics, gravity, matter structure, all remain to be proved by those most versed in such fields. Superseding all appears to be one prime law. Locale 2 is the state of being where that which we label thought is the wellspring of existence. It is the vital creative force that produces energy, assembles matter into form, and provides channels of perception and communication. I suspect that the very self and soul in Locale 2 is no more than an organized vortex or warp in the fundamental. As you think, so you are. In this environment, no mechanical supplements are found. No cars, boats, planes, or rockets are needed for transportation. You think movement, and it is fact. No telephones, radios, TVs, no telephones, radios, televisions, or other communication aids have value. Communication is instantaneous. No farms, gardens, cattle ranches, processing plants, or retail outlets are in evidence. And all experimental visits, no food, energy needed were indicated. How energy is replaced, if it is truly spent, is unknown. Mere thought is the force that supplies any need and desire. What you think is the matrix of your action, situation, and position in this greater reality. This is essentially the message that religion and philosophy have been attempting to convey throughout the ages. Although perhaps less bluntly and often distorted, a facet learned and this medium of thought explains much. It is like attracts like. I didn't realize there was such a rule that acted so specifically. It had been to me nothing more or less than an abstraction. Project this outward, and you begin to appreciate the infinite variations found in Locale 2. Your destiny seems to be grounded completely within the framework of your innermost constant motivations, emotions, and desires. You may not consequently want to go there, but you have no choice. Your supermind soul is stronger and usually makes the decision for you, like attracts like. The interesting aspect of this thought world, or worlds, of Locale 2 is that one does perceive what seems to be solid matter as well as artifacts common to the physical world. These are brought into existence, evidently by three sources. First, they are the product of thought of those who once lived in the physical world, the patterns which still remain. This is accomplished quite automatically without deliberate intent. The second source is those who like certain material things in the physical world, which they have recreated apparently to enhance their surroundings in Locale 2. The third source, one assumes to be higher order of intelligence beings more aware of Locale 2 environment than most inhabitants. Their purpose seems to be that of simulation of the physical environment temporarily, at least for the benefit of those just emerging from the physical world after death. This is done to reduce trauma and shock for the newcomers by introducing familiar shapes and settings in an earlier conversion stage. In the early conversion stages. By this time, one can begin to understand that relationships of the second body to Locale 2. Locale 2 is the natural environment of the second body. The principles involved in this action, composition, perception, control, all correspond to those in the Locale 2. This then is why the majority of the experimental travel attempts took me voluntarily somewhere in Locale 1. The second body is basically not this physical world. To apply it to visit to apply it to visits to George's house or other physical destinations. It's like asking a diver to swim down to the ocean bed without scuba gear and pressure suit. He can do it, but not for long and not too many times. On the other hand, he can walk a mile on the shore daily without ill effects. Thus travel to points in the physical world is a forced process in the second body state. Given the opportunity of the slightest mental relaxation, the supermind will guide you in your second body into locale 2. It is a natural thing to do. Our traditional concept of place suffers badly when we apply locale 2. It seems to interpenetrate our physical world, yet spans limitless reaches beyond comprehension. Many theories have been offered in literature throughout the ages as to the where of it, but few apply to the modern scientific mind. All of the experimental visits to this area have helped little to formulate a more acceptable theory. The most acceptable is the wave vibration concept, which presumes that existence of an infinity of worlds all operating in different frequencies, one of which is the physical world, just as various wave frequencies in the electromagnetic spectrum can simultaneously occupy space. With minimum of interaction, so might the world and worlds of locale 2 be interspersed in our physical matter world. Except for rare or unusual conditions, our natural senses and our instruments, which are extensions thereof, are completely unable to perceive and report this potential. If we consider this premise, the where is answered neatly. Where is here? History of man's science supports the premise. We had no idea that sound existed beyond the range of human hearing until we developed instruments to detect, measure, and create them. Until comparatively recently, those who claimed they could hear what others could not were considered insane and persecuted as witches and sorcerers. We were able to perceive the electromagnetic spectrum only in terms of heat and light until the last century. We are still unaware of the capacity of the human brain and an electrochemical organism in terms of transmission and reception of electromagnetic radiation. With this gap unbridged, it is easy to understand why modern science has not begun to consider the ability of the human mind to penetrate an area where no serious theory has been promulgated. Man, this ice cream truck is just all over, just right in my little area. I don't know what she's doing, man. The music drives me nuts. There is so much to report on locale 2 that it would be impractical to quote directly from the hundreds of referential pages of notes. Visits near and far in locale 2 comprise most of the reported throughout succeeding chapters. It is the summation of consistent experiences that may bring the pattern into focus and pose questions that plead for answers. For every known, there may be 1 million unknown, but at least here is a starting point. In locale 2, reality is composed of the deepest desires, the most frantic fears, thoughts of action, no hiding layers of conditioning or inhibition shield the inner you from others, where honesty is best policy because there can be nothing less. Under the basic standards described above, existence is indeed different. It is this difference that creates the great problems of adjustment, even when attempting to visit there while in the second body. The raw emotion, so carefully repressed in our physical civilization, is unleashed in full force. To say that it is overwhelming at first is a massive understatement. In conscious physical life, this condition would be considered psychotic. My first visits to Locale 2 brought out all the repressed emotional patterns I even remotely considered I had, plus many I didn't know existed. They so dominated my actions that I returned completely abashed and embarrassed at their enormity and my inability to control them. Fear was the dominant theme. Fear of the unknown, fear of unknown, of strange beings, non-physical, of death, of God, of rule breaking, of discovery, of pain, to name only a few. Such fears were stronger than the sexual drive of union, which, as righted elsewhere, was in itself a tremendous obstacle. One by one, painfully and laboriously, the exploding, uncontrollable emotional patterns had to be harnessed. Until this was accomplished, no rational thought was possible. Without regular consistency, they began to return. It is much like a slow learning from insanity to calm objective reasoning. An infant learns to be civilized. It is growth through childhood to adult status. I suspect the same thing occurs all over again in the adaptation to Locale 2. If it doesn't happen during physical life, it becomes the first order of business upon death. This implies that the areas of Locale 2 nearest the physical world in vibratory frequency are peopled for the most part with insane or near insane, emotionally driven beings. For the most part, this seems to be true. They include those alive but sleep and drugged or out in their second bodies. Quite probably those who are dead but still mostly driven. There is evidence to support the former, and the latter seems probable. This near area quite understandably is not a pleasant place to be. It is a level or plane where you belong until you learn better. I don't know what happens to those who don't learn. Perhaps they stay there forever. The moment you dissociate from the physical via the second body, you are on the fringes of this close by section of Locale 2. It is here that one meets all sorts of disjointed personalities and beings. If there is some protective mechanism for the neophyte, it was not apparent to me. Only by cautious and sometimes terrifying experimentation was I able to learn the art or trick of passing through this area. I still am not precisely sure of all the items in this learning process, so have presented only the obvious. Whatever the process, I happily haven't encountered trouble in these passages for several years. Aside from the tormentors and the several outright conflicts noted in the following reports, the principal motivation of these near inhabitants is sexual release in all forms. If considered as a product of recent civilization, including those both alive but sleeping and dead, it is quite simple to understand the need for release from repression of this basic need. The key is that all those in the near section attempt sexuality in terms of the physical body. There is no recognition or knowledge of the sex drive as it is manifested in more distant parts of locale 2. With the lingering conditioning of our own society, it was difficult to avoid participation at times, as response was automatic. Hopefully one learns to control this factor. Like attracts like. To date, I have not observed the death process in any experiments. However, the conclusion that some form of existence in locale 2 follows life activity in the known physical world goes beyond conjecture. Experiences similar to the following, consistent in content over the past 12 years, may be explained by some other concept. At this time, nothing else fits quite so neatly. On one occasion, I had just left the physical when I felt an urge need to go somewhere. Yielding to the insistence, I moved what seemed to be a short distance and stopped suddenly in the bedroom. A body was lying on the bed alone, and he seemed about 10 or 11 in age, and that now familiar inner identity perception was at work rather than just seeing. The boy was alone and afraid and seemed ill. I stayed with him for some time, trying to comfort him. Finally left when he had calmed down, promising I would return. The trip back to the physical was uneventful. I had no idea where I had been. Several weeks later, I felt the physical. I left the physical and was about to concentrate on a given destination when the same boy moved into view. He saw me and moved close to me. He was bewildered but not afraid. He looked up at me and asked, "What do I do now?" I couldn't immediately think of how to reply, so I put my arm over his shoulder and gave him a comforting squeeze. I thought, who am I to instruct and give directions at what seemed a vital moment? The boy was reassured by my presence and relaxed. "Where do I go?" he asked it matter-of-factly. I said the only thing that seemed logical at the time. I told him the way right to lay right where he was, that some friends of his would be along shortly, that they would take him where he was supposed to go. This seemed to satisfy him. I kept my arm around him for a while. Then I became nervous with a single form of physical body, a pattern, and patted him on his shoulder and left. I became nervous with a signal from the physical body, patted him on the shoulder and left. Returning to the physical, I found my neck stiffen from being in an awkward position. After straightening out, I succeeded in going into the second body again to look for the boy. He was gone, or at least I couldn't find him. An interesting sidelight. And the next day, the newspapers carried the story of the death of a 10-year-old boy after a lingering illness. He had died in the afternoon, shortly before I had begun the experiment. I tried to think of some acceptable excuse to approach his parents and get more confirmation, perhaps relieve their grief, but could find none. Only when you have passed the raw emotion stage do you move into the innumerable various but evidently organized activity clusters and locale 2. It is impossible to convey to another the reality of this non-physical eternity. As stated by many in centuries past, it must be experienced. Most importantly, in many of the places visited, the inhabitants are still human, different in a changed environment, but still with human, understandable attributes. On one visit, I ended up in a park-like surrounding with carefully tended flowers, trees, and grass, much like a large mall with paths crisscrossing the area. There were benches along the paths, and there were hundreds of men and women strolling by and sitting on the benches. Some were quite calm, others a little apprehensive, and many had a dazed or shocked look of disorientation. They appeared uncertain, unknowing what to do and what was to take place next. Somehow I knew that this was a meeting place where newly arrived waited for friends and relatives. From this place of meeting, these friends would take each newcomer to the proper place where he or she belonged. I could not think of any reason to stay longer. There was no one nearby to recognize, so I returned to the physical without incident. Another time I deliberately set up to explore in the hope of finding one answer to bring back. Upon disassociating into the second body, I started to move rapidly as I concentrated upon the thought. I wish to go where there are higher intelligences. I kept concentrating as I sped swiftly through a void that seemed endless. Finally, I stopped. I was in a narrow valley, which seemed normal in all respects. There were men and women in ankle-length robes, dark in color. This time I decided for some reason to take another tact. I approached several of the women and asked them if they knew who I was. All were quite polite and treated me with great respect, but gave negative answers. I turned away and asked the same question to a man in a monk's robe who seemed hauntingly familiar. "Yes, I know you," the man replied. There was a strong sense of understanding and friendship in his attitude. I asked him if I truly knew who I was myself. I asked him if I truly knew who I was myself. He looked at me as if he had met an old dear friend, who now had amnesia. "You will," he smiled gently as he said it. I asked him if he knew who I had been last. I was trying to get him to say my name. "You were last a monk in Coscaton, Pennsylvania." I don't know how to pronounce it. Coscaton, Pennsylvania, he replied. I started to get uneasy and apologetically left, and returning to the physical. Recently, a Catholic priest friend took the trouble to investigate this possibility of past life monasticism, and to my surprise and his delight, there is an obscure monastery in Ashketon. He has offered to take me there for a visit, but time, courage, has not been available. Perhaps later. I could report many more of these experiences without fully describing the scope and dimension of the locale too. There have been visits to a group that appeared to be in uniform, which operate highly technical equipment and identify themselves as the target army. The mind's interpretation of what was said. There were hundreds, each waiting for assignments. Their purpose was not disclosed. Another visit took me to a well-organized city where my presence was immediately construed as hostile. Only by taking evasive action, running, hiding, and finally lifting straight up was I able to avoid capture. I don't know what threat I implied to them. In a more direct fashion, the appearance of very aggressive actions tended to confirm again in Locale 2 is not solely a place of serenity and non-conflict. On other trips, I was accosted by conventionally dressed men warily. I waited to see what he would do. Do you know or remember Arrocio El Franco? He asked the question bluntly. I replied that I did not. Still cautious, I am sure you will remember if you think back. The man said firmly. There was a subtle demanding in his attitude which made me uneasy. I replied that I was sure I didn't remember anyone by that name. Do you know anyone at all down there? He asked. I had just said that I didn't when I suddenly went limp and the man grabbed me. He took one of my arms and I felt someone else take the other. They started to drag me in the direction of what seemed to be the three bright spots of light. I struggled and finally broke loose when I remembered to use the go-to physical signal. I moved away rapidly and after a short time was back in the office and into the physical. Evidently, hopefully, I had been mistaken for someone else. Still another trip had a human attributes. I had arrived in no particular place, just a grayness, and was trying to decide what to do when a woman approached me. I am from the church. I am here to help you, she said calmly. She came close and immediately sensed the female sexuality, but held back as I didn't think the church intended this kind of help. I was wrong. After a bit, I thanked her and turned to see a man standing nearby, watching. He spoke in a strong voice, heavy with sarcasm. Well, now, are you ready to learn the secrets of the universe? I masked my embarrassment by asking who he was. Albert Mather. He almost shouted it. I also got the impression that he was calling me by this name. I hope you're ready, he went on, his voice rising in anger, because nobody took the trouble to tell me when I got back there. I didn't hear the rest. It was as if a roar of static interfered. I moved away, not sure how his anger would vent itself, and returned to the physical uneventfully. In checking, I found no significant historical record of an Albert Mather, long A. Albert Mather, I guess, who seems to have no relationship to Minister Cotton Mathers of the 18th century. Other experiences in Locale 2 were more friendly. As indicated elsewhere, in most there is no discernible pattern as to what attracted me to some of the strange situations. Perhaps this will come eventually. Two unusual recurring conditions must be added to the coverage of this area. A number of times, the motion of travel, which is usually rapid and smooth, has been interrupted by what feels like a violent hurricane-like gust, and the spatiality through which one moves. Spatiality, I can't even pronounce the word. It is as if you are being blown away by this uncontrolled force, tossed haphazardly around end to end over end, like a leaf in a gale. It is impossible to move against this torrent or do anything but let it carry you. Finally, you are tossed near the edge of the current and you drop out unharmed. There is nothing to identify it, but it feels natural rather than artificially created. The second condition is the sign in the sky. I observed this on 5 or 6 occasions when escorted by the helpers. It is an incredible series of crude symbols strung in an arc directly across one section of Locale 2. When moving through the area, everyone has to go around this barrier, as it is solid, movable, and immutable. The symbols, as best my seeing could determine, were crude, stick-like illustrations of a man, an older woman, a house, what looked to be algebraic equations. It was from one of these helpers that I learned the story of the sign. He told it with some humor, almost apologetically. It seems that an almost meaningless, almost a measureless time ago, a very wealthy, by what standards is not known, and powerful woman wanted to ensure that her son would get into heaven. A church offered a guarantee to guarantee this to her, provided she paid the church a tremendous sum of money. The woman paid the church, but her son did not get into heaven. In anger and revenge, she used her entire remaining wealth and power to have the sign put up in the skies of heaven, so that throughout all eternity, all who saw it would know of the dishonesty and rascality of the particular church. It was a job well done. The names of the woman, her son, and the church are lost in antiquity, but the sign remains, impervious to efforts of scientists through the ages to bring it down and destroy it. The source of the apology and slight embarrassment is not the perfidy of some obscure sect, but the inability of anyone to take down the sign. As a result, all studies of science in this part of Locale 2 must necessarily include it. It would be much the same if someone artificially created an element between cobalt and copper. If you study chemistry, by necessity you would have to include this odd element. Or if a huge artificial moon were created and it was beyond our science to bring it down, students of astronomy would include it in their lessons as a common fact. That's the story as it was told me. The greatest difficulty is the inability of the conscious mind, trained and conditioned in the physical world, to accept the existence of this infinite Locale 2. Our young Western mental science tend to deny its existence. Our religions affirm it in a broad, distorted abstraction. Accepted sciences contradict such a possibility and can find no supporting evidence through their instruments of research and measurement. Most of all, there is the barrier. Why it exists is not truly known by anyone, at least in the Western world. This is the same screen that lowers when you awake and from sleep, blotting out your last dream or memory of your visit to Locale 2. This is not to imply that every dream is the product of the Locale 2 visit, but some of them may well be translated the translation of Locale 2's experiences. Translation, the symbolization of Locale 2 experience, is not necessarily part of the barrier. Rather, it would seem to be the effort of the conscious to interpret superconscious Locale 2 events which are beyond its ability to comprehend or pictorialize. Observation via second body and Locale 1 here now provide that the most ordinary functions and actions were subject to misinterpretations, especially when observed out of the context. Locale 2 and environment totally unfamiliar to the conscious offer that much greater margin for interpretive error. As could be inferred, I suspect that many, most, or all human beings visit Locale 2 at some time during the sleep state. Why such visits are necessary, I don't know. Perhaps one day, some year, our life sciences will unravel this knowledge and a new era will be born for mankind. With this will come the entire new science based upon Locale 2 data someday, if mankind can wait that long. And that's the end of chapter 5. Once again, Robert A. Monroe, The Journeys Out of the Body. Interesting read. My book.